Funding for nonprofits is changing. Community needs are growing, and NGOs are being asked to do more with less. Welcome to the Change Makers Junction, where ideas meet action. The podcast exploring how we can build sustainable organizations across Africa. Join us for this episode as we rethink the future of organizational sustainability. Welcome to the Change Makers Junction. This is a space where we discuss civil society, its leadership, its posture, its future. What is civil society looking like in Africa, Zimbabwe, Nigeria? So in the last conversation that we had, Dr. Murisa, we spoke about crisis, that the nonprofit space, CSOs, are going through some form of a crisis. And you always talk about naming the problem correctly.
Yeah.
So let's discuss that. What does the crisis look like?
Yeah, so I think this particular moment or the framing around a crisis, thanks for having me, by the way, the way we say crisis and we just throw everything there does not help us to fashion solutions. So we have to name it for what it is. I think there's something compelling about the moment, and it is problematic. It's the decline in funding and the narrative that is coming out of Global North institutions around us pulling by our bootstraps, etc., etc. I think there's that real challenge. There's also the crisis of expectation, because even though funding is declining, many organizations are being asked to continue doing what they were doing. Mm-hmm. Communities are not yet aware to say, oh, organization X that was helping us with water, etc., no longer has funding. So the crisis is really like there's that tension. The supply chain is broken somewhere. But I think for me, the other part of the crisis, which could be, because I'm told that in the Chinese language, another word, a crisis is actually a framing around an opportunity. I think for me, in the naming of the crisis, we should be able to then begin to think through solutions. One of them being around redrafting or redrawing our world around the support ecosystem. Who else can we work with outside of our usual patterns of saying you respond for a request for proposal, you go to a certain donor, a certain embassy, to begin to think through to say, outside of these usual circuits of money, where else can we go to? That's number one. Number two, the crisis is also in us within the sector, that we're not trained around responding to these challenges. Mm-hmm. That's why I like to always say when people raise this, I always use my home country, Zimbabwe, and maybe our friends in Nigeria to say, for a long time, civil society organizations in these countries were facing challenges, facing huge challenges. So now with this crisis, maybe we start off by going to those countries and to say, how did CSOs respond? How did they survive? How did they navigate this space?
Please allow me to throw in a very controversial question, and I'm sure you've had this conversation before. There was a discussion, I don't know whether it was between you and me or it was with other colleagues at CVO, where we were saying NGOs ideally are supposed to work themselves out of a job, right?
Yeah.
Or out of work, and we are responding to wicked problems, which is why we are actually here as nonprofits. Is this crisis here now because we have failed to work ourselves out of jobs or out of our organizations?
Yes and no, but half the time, credible organizations that are doing important work are dealing with what we call wicked problems. These are deep-seated challenges. They do not fizzle out after a 6-month project financing, after 12 months. I was listening to your colleagues at CVO in the advocacy team, giving us examples of advocacy initiatives that took 10 years. Just to deal with coming up with a law around child rights, taking 10 years. So yes, they're supposed to work themselves out of a job, but it's not happening overnight. It takes time. We're dealing with an intractable problem of poverty, an intractable problem of inequality, new challenges of climate change, new challenges of weakening democracies across the continent, etc. So unless and until Africa makes that leap to a place whereby our democratic institutions are working properly, that's the word. We have mechanisms, both the state and the market is responsive to issues to do with poverty. Then we can begin to say we've closed the chapter. But for those who read the Bible, the Lord Jesus Christ said this statement, and I always say, maybe this is how we're damned. He says, the poor you shall always have.
They'll always be with you.
So does it mean then we will never be able to deal with poverty effectively? If that's the case, then you need NGOs, because NGOs have played a huge ameliorating role over the years to really deal with the challenges of weak policy inconsistencies on the part of government, and also the excesses of the market, because the market promotes greed, does not redistribute assets or resources properly. So NGOs have come and stood at the center. But they've stood at the center maybe for too long. Maybe they've created dependencies instead of creating independent actors. That's something that has to be interrogated with the model of NGOs. But do we still need NGOs? Yes, 100%.
Absolutely agree with you, but I had to just throw that question in there.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So we speak about the crisis, and also as we talk about the crisis, I think that actually might help people then focus on what you've just mentioned.
Yeah.
The crisis that we talk about, does it affect NGOs the same?
Yeah. So look, depending on the context, the country, etc. Let me use Zimbabwe, for instance. In Zimbabwe, we have 2 or 3 types of CSOs. We have CSOs that are seen even by government as problematic. These are your human rights organizations, the policy analysis organizations, the governance-focused organizations, because they have spoken truth to power, they've challenged the governance dynamics, etc. Then there are certain NGOs that are literally the darlings of the state because they're involved in last-mile service delivery in health, in education, in sanitation, etc. So those are different. And even the way they are funded, the kind of relationships they've established. So the service delivery organizations, I argue, they have a better case or they have a better model of long-term sustainability. Because in many instances, we find them embedded within communities. In many instances, we find them having official agreements with ministries, the Ministry of Health, etc., recognized as development partners.
Right.
So even the government itself realizes their importance and is invested in their long-term sustainability. So that's something that we have to understand. Because when people talk about civil society, at times they're just talking about a certain niche, the governance focused, human rights focused. And those are the ones who've been receiving huge amounts of mostly outside funding. So when governments are coming up with these measures around trying to stop outside funding, the target is not the organization that is extending malaria tablets, etc. The target is this guy who's speaking truth to power, the human rights focused organization, etc. So I think even in our treatment of sustainability models, we need to understand that. We need to really factor in that to say there's a sector that is under threat. For me, it's a subsector within civil society. The governance, human rights, focused entities, policy analysis, policy advocacy, corruption watch, etc., etc. Those ones are on the spotlight of political elites because they have, over the years, created discomfort in corridors of power by raising issues that they'll rather keep hidden under the carpet. But the others, they like them. The others invite them to come and speak at when they're donating things, etc., etc. So what we're really seized with is, given the challenges we have with policy inconsistency, the challenges with constitutionalism, there's a very specific set of organizations that we need to make sure that they survive throughout this crisis.
So when you speak of the crisis, this one that you just mentioned around the subsector of NGOs, is that only the legal aspect of the crisis that you're referring to, or does funding also come in there? Funding
comes in because what we're having is, for years, major donors, the Americans, the British, were sympathetic to this sector. So they'll make sure that they invest resources. Because even our high net worth philanthropies, etc., do not touch that sector because of the way they are linked to their home governments in terms of the tenders, the licensing regulations. They don't want to be seen to be supporting these organizations. Because remember, these organizations have been called or bastardized in certain instances as, agents of regime change. Or running dogs of imperialism, etc., etc. So because of that, they've always depended on outside help. They've always been under threat. Some of them have had their offices closed, some actors imprisoned, etc., etc. But they play an important role of trying to deepen and to nurture democracy and try to actually deal with the challenges of governance, policy inconsistencies, misallocation of public resources, etc., calling out erratic leaders, etc. So these are the ones that have not received, to my knowledge, have not received African resources to support their work, except for a few instances. They've mostly received external funding. So it's this external funding that is now under threat. That's what we're discussing now, especially the closure of USAID and then the sort of declines around the EU countries, including the UK, etc. And so what has happened now, what remains as a pillar of support is private philanthropy. But private philanthropy is stretched because globally we're talking of a moment around the challenges to do with democracy and rising authoritarianism. So everywhere where global philanthropy is, their resources are stretched because they are having to deal with many challenges. So this exposes the nascent but growing African-based movement for governance reforms, for constitutional reform.
Right. Thank you for pointing that out and the differences in nonprofits and how the crisis is affecting them, be it a legal crisis or the funding crisis. In our previous episode, you spoke about muscle memory and that nonprofits aren't going through this crisis for the first time.
Yeah.
They've been here before and found ways out of it. Can we just take a little dive into that?
Yeah, so I think, when you are trying to deal with a public problem, half the time there could be a region that has already confronted a problem and dealt with it. That's what we're calling muscle memory, to say, how did you come out of that situation? So for instance, COVID-19 just hit us. All of us remember what we had to do to survive through COVID-19. Right. There are many countries that have gone through major famines. And when you go to those countries and to begin to say, what did you do? How did you respond? We learn a lot. So for me, this particular moment, I would argue that we need to study Zimbabwe in a different way. Because I think when we studied Zimbabwe, we've always studied Zimbabwe around public policies, yada, yada, and the responses. But to really study non-profits in Zimbabwe, civil society organizations in the human rights space, governance space, that have confronted government over the years and made major gains around constitutional reform in 2013, etc. How did they survive? Because I do not think they ever had a moment whereby they said, oh, we have an abundance of resources. Because even donors were skeptical. And I think by 2015, 16, we're beginning to speak of donor fatigue to the human rights cause in Zimbabwe. But still, organizations survived. Some died, unfortunately. But those that survived have muscle memory. They can tell us a story of how they survived. I think when I look at Zimbabwe, one of the major things that came out of Zimbabwe is collaboration. So that's why you have all these umbrella organizations. The Crisis Coalition was an umbrella organization. ZIMCO, the Zimbabwe Coalition around Debt and Development, a coalition. Even in the gender space, coalitions. That was one way of surviving, to say we do not want just to expose one organization to authoritarianism, but create an umbrella, create a network. And resources were spread, and even solidarity was shared that way. So I think that's one way in which we learn from Zimbabwe. But also to learn to say, how did you survive the currency crisis? How did you survive the currency crisis? Organizations in Zimbabwe would receive, even if it's a dollar-denominated contract, they had to liquidate it into local currency. How did you survive all that? How did you accumulate assets during that time? So I think these are questions that many of our African counterparts have to either make the trip or connect with Zimbabwean organizations and to begin to learn. The same with Nigeria. Because in Nigeria, during the fight around against military regimes, etc., civil society was under threat as well from the military regime, but also funding was not easily available. So to begin to learn from all those organizations, especially the organizations that were set up by the now departed Innocent Chukuma and many others, around defense of human rights, defense of constitutionalism, promoting multi-party democracy under austere conditions. Because what I'm sensing is there are countries that have not gone through this moment. I don't want to mention the countries because people may think I'm being whatever. So there are countries that have not gone through this moment and they're going through it for the first time. Yeah. So those countries, to them, this is like, oh, this is the end of the road for us, etc., etc. But for Zimbabwean and Nigerian organizations, this could just be a hiccup. It's just a hiccup. We're dealing with this, but we need to move forward. So I think experience sharing becomes important for us to have a common understanding and a common response.
I love that you've spoken about coalitions and people coming together and learning from each other. It's a very pivotal thing to growth and responding. I think my question will be around, as we bring this to a close, is this not a different type of crisis? Can we really take the lessons that we have learned from dealing with what you've just spoken about to apply it to where we are right now?
Yeah, look, I tend to subscribe to the thinking that we've got what we call mountaintop experiences and valley experiences. We're in the valley. The next one is a mountaintop experience. Life is like that. It's not even. So I think there's a realization amongst many, even those who are outside of government in America right now, who believe in the importance of a thriving civil society. So we do not know how Americans are going to vote again after this particular president. And we are not so sure how they will respond, if they will continue with these policies or they will change. So already that tells you that something can change. There's room for engagement. But also I think what keeps me awake at night is to say, how do we mobilize our own resources? Because I think what this crisis teaches us is that it is not safe. And we were going through a very dangerous path where we're depending on external resources to build our institutions. So this particular moment for me brings back the issue around institutional building and how we build. It matters. And one of the things in which we build is to say, how do we connect with people who directly benefit from our work? I've always said this to say, I'm surprised by how the corporate sector in Africa works. The corporate sector in Africa is a beneficiary of the advocacy work, the advocacy around rule of law, property rights, that comes out of civil society. They benefit and they make a profit, but they don't reinvest in that. But because of this disruption, we have to have new conversations. Because capitalists in Africa are accumulating just like their counterparts in the global north, but they're not reinvesting in civil society, in the infrastructure, in keeping organizations going, etc. In Zimbabwe, we started a conversation around GBV. It's just an entry point. Right. That's not the end. We're just starting to have conversations with corporates to begin to say, look, some of these incidences of gender-based violence are coming from the corporate place. Some of them are driven by how you actually underpay people and they end up fighting in their homes. So we're beginning to expose the contradictions in capital accumulation within corporates and how it affects society. So I think we're going to have to do more around that to begin to say, this stability that you require for you to accumulate, invest, etc., comes from advocacy that has been done by civil society around constitutionalism, rule of law, property rights, lack of corruption, accountability, etc. Because these are the things that create a conducive environment for capital to prosper. But the same capitalists who are benefiting are not investing. So this is, like I always say, a crisis always gives you a window of opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to have difficult conversations amongst ourselves as Africans around how we can also make sure that corporates, I'm talking about local corporates, that are benefiting from this current wave of accumulation can begin to invest in civil society.
Lovely, you've put that so well. And as you said, life is about mountains and valleys. And currently the CSOs and nonprofits in Africa are in the valley. And we've discussed why they're actually in the valley and how the valley, which is the crisis, is affecting them. And what lessons can we learn from other valleys that we've passed through, right?
Sure.
So as we come to a close to this particular episode, we encourage you to continue watching the Changemakers Junction and find out more. How can you find your way back at the top of the mountain as a nonprofit in Africa? Thank you for watching. We'll see you again soon. That's it for this episode of Changemakers Junction, where ideas meet action. For more sharp conversations on NGO sustainability and organizational resilience, subscribe to Changemakers Junction on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Share this episode, keep the conversation going, and join us next time as we turn ideas into action.